why Mormonism is changing so rapidly when it didn't change for a long, long time. Part of the reason it didn't change for a long, long time is because it settled in the Intermountain West and sort of built a wall around itself. And a lot of the trends and currents of critical theology and cultural change just sort of went drifting over the Salt Lake Valley and Utah as a whole and went over to California or back the other direction. And so Mormonism could just sort of hide out there. But then when Mormonism began growing rapidly in the late 1970s, especially into the 1980s, and I've told people this statistic before. There was a point in time in the early 1980s when the average Southern Baptist church had 274 members, and on an average week, 273 Southern Baptists became Mormons. So that was one church wholesale per week converting to Mormonism. That's how fast they were growing. And you can't stay hidden in Utah when you grow that. And so we started seeing the results of this in the late 90s. When we first started going out to the Mormon temple in Mesa and then going up to the Salt Lake temple in Salt Lake City for the general conference, and first weekend in April, first weekend in October, everybody you talked to, you knew what they were going to believe. Now, there were some variations. There was Mormonism was never quite as lockstep as Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, the range of belief for witnesses was like this. For Mormons, it was like this. But you still had you knew what you're going to be discussing. That started changing in the late 90s. And that's when Mormonism started to try to mainstream. When I first started talking to Mormons, they didn't claim to be Christians. They wanted to differentiate themselves from. The first thing that the missionaries would talk to you about when they came to your door was the first vision. And in the first vision, Joseph Smith is told that all the churches are corrupt, their creeds are an abomination, They wanted to differentiate themselves right from the start. Well, they don't do that anymore. That's not their goal anymore. And I don't know if they've noticed, but their growth numbers stink. Their growth numbers are basically natural. So in other words, Mormons tend to have lots of kids, at least they used to. Even that's changing. So conversions and natural growth are pretty much just keeping up with how many people will leave in the back door. A lot of people leaving Mormonism. And I just don't think they've figured out when that started. And evidently the leadership's like, we're not going back to the way it used to be. Yeah, what's the future? Well, that's just it. Once in a while, I'd run into a Mormon that did more reading in their early writings than most Mormons did. And so they knew that there were differences of opinion about, for example, intelligences. Do intelligences exist? What's the nature of intelligences? So yeah, once in a while you'd run into someone and, you don't necessarily get into that conversation with every conversation you have, but you'd run into folks that would recognize that Orson Pratt was a little bit of a firebrand, and so he had some interesting views over here, and Brigham Young had a few different views over here, and B.H. Roberts, and at least there were still Mormons reading Talmage, Roberts, people like that. When I first started dealing with Mormonism, it's really hard to run into people now that even know who those guys were or even care. I mean, there was a set of books that would be given to almost every missionary before he went on his mission. Jesus the Christ, Articles of Faith, A Marvelous Work and a Wonder by LeGrand Richards, and Mormon Doctrine by Bruce R. McConkie. So I started dealing with Mormonism during the McConkie era. And Bruce R. McConkie was a forceful personality. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Mormonism, there are currently 14. Did you hear about this? There are 14 apostles. There's almost always 15. You have the first presidency, then you have the quorum of the 12. So the first presidency is the prophet and his two counselors. They're all apostles. That's 3. Then you have the quorum of the 12. 3 plus 12, 15. There are 14 right now because the head of the quorum of the 12 died last week sometime. Because they're all really old. Okay, it's just how it works. But normally there are 15 living apostles. And you need to understand they used to, anyways, understand these apostles to have the same level of apostolic authority as Paul or Peter or James or whoever else. Any of the original 12. Now, that authority was lost within a few generations of the founding of the church. Exactly why they call it the Great Apostasy, but then it was restored in 1829, prior to the founding of the LDS Church. Now, that was actually mythological. It didn't happen in 1829. It was made up by Joseph Smith years later, as David Whitmer testified, and as is clear from the changes that Joseph Smith made in the 1833 Book of Commandments. But anyway, so you have men living today on earth, according to Mormonism, who are apostles in the same way that John was an apostle. And so Bruce R. McConkie was one of those apostles. And he wrote a book called Mormon Doctrine. I mean, thank you very much. So here's Mormon Doctrine. I guess is this your copy? Okay, this is Rich's copy of Mormon Doctrine. If you see this book in a used bookstore, grab it, because it's becoming rare. The church wants this to disappear. When we would go to Salt Lake City, we would, during General Conference, at lunch, we would go over to the LDS bookstore. It was huge. The whole bottom floor, it's 2 floors, the whole bottom floor was theology, the writing of the apostles. They had a huge LDS scripture section, copies of the LDS scripture in every kind of leather binding you wanted, different colors and things like that. Anyway, McConkie was huge at that time. He was, I think, probably one of the best. He's probably the best known of the 12 at that time. Now, when he put this book out, some of the 12 didn't appreciate it. But this is written by an LDS apostle. Can you imagine if we had a book called Christian Doctrine by Peter or by Thaddeus or one of the 12 we don't know a lot about from the first century? How important that would be. And it's written as a, so like Master Mahan, mediation, mediums, medicine, mediator, Melchizedek. So it's just, you just look things up, Passover, just look it up. That's what everybody wants for a doctrine book. It's alphabetical order. I'll just look up what I want to know about. There it is, by an LDS apostle. You can hardly even find it anymore. Why? When we used to go up there, there'd be an entire section of McConkie's books. The Promised Messiah, Mormon Doctrine, Now, good luck. Good luck finding anything. You're not going to find that book. It's gone.
Yeah, it might as well be Barnes & Noble.
Well, actually, the really sad thing is they've got all the Precious Moments stuff, too. It's like Precious Moments invades Christian bookstores, kills them, then invades the LDS bookstore, killed them, too. Precious Moments, the Star Trek tribbles of the media world. I'm not sure how I made that connection, but anyway, so here's the point. McConkie's view of pre-existent spirits. There's always been controversy in Mormonism about how to handle the problem of the King Follett funeral discourse and what's called the Sermon in the Grove. Now, I think I just need to make a note and do a program soon where we don't have to worry about Christless Christian nationalists pretending they're actually politicians and like they have some kind of power other than the amount of clicks they get. And just do a read-through of the King Follett funeral discourse and the Sermon in the Grove. These were the last major doctrinal, theological statements made by Joseph Smith, and often they're conflated, partly because in what's called Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, but I should just have my books in here, just leave them somewhere around. In Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith by Joseph Fielding Smith, that's how most people have been exposed to the King Follett funeral discourse from Joseph Smith, was in the form it's placed there, but that's sort of an edited version, and it also sort of brings in elements of the Sermon in the Grove, which you may not notice as you're reading it, that you're reading two different presentations. But that really becomes the central driving element of LDS theology. This is where Joseph Smith said, "We've imagined and supposed that God was God from all eternity. I will refute the idea and take away the veil so that you may see." Direct quote. Yeah, I memorized it. Long time ago. Those brain cells are still alive, amazingly. They have survived the degradation of all the rest. This is where you get the concept of plurality of gods, eternal progression. And this is why I say, if Joseph Smith had not been murdered I think very clearly by the Masons. In June of 1844, if he had been given even as little as one more year, but definitely 2 more years, there would be no Mormonism. The rapidity with which he was changing, evolving, would have rendered the movement indefensible and incoherent. It was changing that fast. And it was only his death that rescued it and allowed Brigham Young and the others to go to Utah, hide in the mountains, and sort of fill in the blanks that Smith left unfilled. And so it's interesting, a lot of the modern conversation taking place amongst Mormons, what you keep hearing them saying is, well, we can't really tell from what Joseph Smith said. That's because he wasn't done. He didn't think he was going to die in that jail. And it wasn't his intention to be leaving behind a finished systematic theology. And once those primitive founders, such as Brigham Young, Orson Hyde, Orson Pratt, Parley Pratt, Woodsoe, etc., when they get to Utah, they've got to somehow come up with some kind of coherent, or at least semi-coherent theology, without a whole lot of interaction with the outside world, really, which is interesting. Anyway, they come up with a belief, and I make this presentation called the Eternal Law of Progression, or the Law of Eternal Progression, but even those are 2 different takes. There are Mormons who believed that God has reached the ultimate level of exaltation, and there were others who believed, no, everybody is progressing. It's the law of eternal progression rather than the eternal law of progression. There's two different ways of understanding that. So you get to our time period now. What's happened is the church, whether it was done purposefully or not, I don't know, sent their best and their brightest from BYU out into secular universities, out into Ivy League schools, provided financing for them to go get their PhDs and to raise the perspective of Mormonism by having these Ivy League trained scholars teaching at BYU. So they'd go out, they'd get their PhDs, they'd come back to teach at BYU. Problem is, but maybe they didn't realize, I don't know, these guys come back and they inject critical theory directly in the bloodstream of Mormonism. And they're becoming the next generation of apostles, general authorities. And the fact of the matter is, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, for Good Price cannot survive critical analysis. What it says happened in the New World didn't happen in the New World. And the result is a large number of Mormonism's scholars keep teaching there, but they don't really believe it. It's like all the Roman Catholics at many Jesuit schools around the world that continue to teach the bodily assumption as a dogma, but then over lunch in the lunchroom, they're presenting it as mythology because it is mythology. It didn't happen. It's not apostolic by any stretch of the imagination. So the same thing happening in Utah. And so a new Mormonism is developing. Yes, sir?
Well, I was just going to, you reminded me of a debate that you did, I think it was with Richard Hopkins up in Salt Lake City. And I'll just never forget, because I was the guy running around the audience at the end with the microphone.
Oh.
And I'll never forget this very elderly Mormon gentleman who had the hardest rock hands I've ever seen in my life. This man has worked with his hands in the ground his whole life. And he took hold of that microphone, and I didn't fight him. And he wanted to engage you, but he looked at Hopkins, and he said, I don't know where you're coming up with this stuff, but that's not the Mormonism I know.
Yeah.
All right? And he just wanted to take him to town. And, we were seeing the seeds of this back then.
Yeah. Oh, I remember talking to an older Mormon fellow on the northeast corner of Temple Square. And so that's on the side where the temple's over on that side. And he pointed up to Moroni, the Moroni that fell down during the earthquake. He pointed up to Moroni and he said, within 25 years, there'll be a cross up there. Now, that hasn't happened, but His point was, this church is changing, it's evolving. And it's changing away from what it once was. You're getting a radical subjectivism in Mormonism. And what Aaron was saying is that the young men they talk to up there in Provo, which is where BYU is at, if you have your pulse on BYU, you have your pulse on Mormonism 20, 25 years from now. And the subjectivism there, the willingness, when we would go out to Mesa, when we go to Salt Lake City back in the olden days, the young guys, not even the missionaries, the 12 and 13-year-old guys, they knew what they believed. They don't know it anymore. And you start talking to these university-aged guys, and the range of belief is amazing. They're all gravitating toward Blake Ostler. And Aaron provided some quotes from Ostler that were really, really interesting, such as, quote, "I personally believe that Brigham Young's theology was a disaster for the most part." Now, think for a second. Brigham Young was the second president of the church. And I know this is one of those places where the emphasis in Mormonism has been changing over the years. Look, well, what doctrine has been changed? It's not so much the doctrine as the emphasis upon what doctrines you're teaching. So it used to be a big thing, get your patriarchal blessing. And your patriarchal blessing, you were told the line of priesthood authority that was being given to you. And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of the people alive back then traced their priesthood authority back through Brigham Young. If Brigham Young was a disaster, and the church has thrown Brigham Young under the bus for his racial view, if he wasn't what he claimed to be, modern Mormonism has no authority, at least by its own reasoning, its own argumentation. But people just don't seem to think about that anymore. And Mormons used to think that there was an objective element to their claim to be the one true church. But that's becoming rarer and rarer amongst the LDS. It's becoming much more subjective. And so you've got young guys, they wouldn't believe a word this guy had to say, even though he claimed to be an apostle. And they don't have any problem with it. They have no problem going, sure he was an apostle. It's just his opinion. It's just his opinion. Defining LDS doctrine. When I wrote Is the Mormon My Brother, I spent a tremendous amount of time laying out how to define Mormon doctrine officially, what documents you can actually use. And I was using Mormon documents to define this. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of Mormons today, they don't care about any of that. It's become completely subjective. And this Blake Ostler is one of the people leading this charge with very unusual theology, especially in regards to the nature of God, Godhead, stuff like that. He's not presenting historical Orthodox Mormonism at all. And Aaron says that a lot of the young men up there they gravitate to him because he has solved the problem of eternal regression. Because if before every God there had to be exaltation to godhood, and it goes back and back and back, eventually you have to answer the question, well, where did the first God come from? If you have an increasing number of gods now, then you have a decreasing number of gods to go back in time. And so eventually you get to a God who had to be a man before he became a God, but where did he come from? That's the regression thing. Ostler says, no, that's not what we have to believe. We do not have to believe in the eternal law of progression. Well, that's what's been taught by the Mormon church. Yeah, but we don't have to believe it. So that's not Mormonism. So if the church is going to allow, if the Mormon church is going to allow that latitude from its youngest men who will be filling the positions of authority in the church, this church is not going to last another quarter century without splitting into 1,000 pieces. All the money in the world is not going to keep that from happening, because they do have all the money in the world. Okay, they are filthy rich, but even that cannot hold together a completely fractured system that has no central theological elements any longer. And so one thing I mentioned in the meeting, man, it was a lot easier witnessing to Mormons when I was 23 years old, when we started doing that kind of stuff. Well, we did it before then, but a whole lot easier. Sure, there was still subjectivism. Sure, you had the Mormon testimony you had to deal with, all that kind of stuff. But nobody was willing to just simply laugh off an apostle, laugh off a prophet. They are now on their own authority. And I don't know how long that can last. The momentum's still there, the money's still there, the family connection stuff, that's going to keep stuff going for a while. But it can't do it forever. It can't keep it up forever. And so I really, really do wonder what the fractured elements of Mormonism are going to look like. And we certainly need to continue to pray for those working amongst the Mormons up there, because I thought we had to learn a lot back in my day, but now you're having to learn variations on the variations. It's like becoming a chess grandmaster, how many openings you have to cram into your brain, all the different variations you can run into when we're talking about Mormonism. Now you may go, well, I don't care about any of that stuff. Well, there are a lot of Mormons that are starting to question, and they need knowledgeable Christians to be able to answer their questions and direct them toward the truth. So I hope you would give that consideration, especially if you know Mormons in your life, to be prepared to talk to them on that level.